Alright, so this is the lecture on personality. And generally, personality is defined as a unique, stable pattern of thinking, feeling, and behavior, and a general style of interacting with others. We assume that these behaviors are generally consistent over time. And we use personality theories to describe the patterns of how people are similar or different and why people are unique. So generally we distinguish between traits, which are specific and habitual ways of thinking and feeling, so being shy or outgoing, that are true regardless of situations, versus states, which are temporary ways of behaving based on the environment. So for example, aggressiveness in a road rage issue, you're feeling a state of anger. You need to know, is it just because of this specific circumstance, or is this person typically an aggressive person? So one of the first personality theorists was Freud, whose general theory was called psychoanalysis, and he focused on unconscious processes and instinct in early childhood experiences. So his was the psychodynamic theory. So psycho means the mind, and dynamic means energy. And so it's about the struggle between the mind and consciousness. And he argues that our behavior is really driven by unconscious motives. And we're not necessarily directly aware of them, but they influence our behavior. So in terms of the structure of personality, Freud believed that the id was present at birth. The id is unconscious, and its main goal is to avoid pain and obtain pleasure. So this is about kind of animal instincts, hunger, thirst, sex, aggression, and it's based on the pleasure principle, which is looking for instant gratification regardless of the consequences. And it kind of pits the life instincts, which are eros, to perpetuate the species, versus the death instinct like aggression. Next is the ego, which deals with the need for reality, and it kind of figures out how to modify our behaviors to fit the demands of a society, find kind of socially appropriate outlets for sexual and aggressive impulses. So the ego is very concerned about the consequences of our actions, and it's based on the reality principle. It takes into account what's practical and acceptable. And then finally, the superego is the moral center of our personality, our consciousness. This is kind of your internal voice that's telling you that's not a good idea. And Freud used this iceberg analogy. And so the idea is that there are parts of our personality that we are consciously aware of, that's above the water, but the bulk of our personality is actually submerged under the water, and that's in our subconscious. We're not consciously aware of this. So this conflict between what we are consciously aware of and what we are not aware of leads to defense mechanisms, which are basically unconscious self-deception. They relieve tension between the impulses of the id and the realities of the society. So the defense mechanisms are kind of the ego acting unconsciously. So the first is repression. Repression is when bad or anxiety-provoking memories are pushed out of consciousness. So the idea is that something traumatic happens and you have no conscious recollection of it. This is pretty controversial. Most people remember traumatic events in great detail, so it's unlikely that we would have repressed traumatic memories, and it's really hard to ever prove. Next is projection. So projection is when repressed desires are attributed to someone else. So if you are angry at a friend, but you don't feel like it's acceptable to be angry at a friend, and instead you accuse your friend of being angry at you. Next is displacement. And so this is when you have unacceptable drives that are directed to an acceptable alternative. So if you've had a really bad day at work and you want to yell at your boss, it's not acceptable to yell at your boss, so you come home and yell at your kids or your dog instead. Next is sublimation, and so this is when unconscious desires are channeled into activities desired by society. So you have a really aggressive person who becomes a really top competitive trial lawyer. So they've channeled their aggressive energy into something that's acceptable. Next is reaction formation. And so this is when an anxiety producing feeling is experienced as the less threatening opposite. So you feel, let me give you the classic example, homophobia. So the idea is that people who are extremely homophobic, have very negative views of gay and lesbian individuals, have a tendency towards homosexuality themselves, but they fear it. And so instead they convert that into a strong hatred. So there was one study that found that men who were high on homophobia had them watch a male homosexual video, and basically they measured physical arousal, and basically they found that the men who were the most homophobic had the most sexual arousal, even though they didn't report any. So you're taking an unaccepted desire and turning it into the opposite. Regression is reverting back to an earlier stage. So, you have a child who's potty trained, and then a new sibling comes home and they start bedwetting. Denial is denying that anything bad is happening. So you have, parents whose kids are abusing drugs who don't admit that they're the problem until the kid is in the hospital or in jail. Okay, so next, Freud argued that personality develops from 5 stages of psychosexual development. It's all about the child seeking pleasure through various parts of their body. So you have sexual impulses that are centered around different parts of the body. And there are a lot of conflicts throughout each stage. And so these can lead to fixations if the person doesn't resolve the conflict. And these fixations can lead to permanent kind of changes in personality. Okay, so first is the oral stage. This is the first year of life, and the mouth is seen as the erogenous zone, and the big conflict here is weaning. So people who get fixations at this stage have oral fixations like smoking or nail biting or things like that. Next is the anal stage from ages 1 to 3, and so here the primary conflict is toilet training. And so unresolved conflict happens when parents are either too harsh or too lenient about toilet training. So anal expulsive personality is when a fixation leads to someone being messy or destructive or hostile. Anal retentive personality is when a fixation leads to somebody being excessively neat or fussy or stingy. Next is the phallic stage, and so this is ages 3 to 6, and this is where kids really discover their sexual feelings. This happens a little differently for boys and girls. Boys go through the Oedipus complex, where they develop kind of incestuous desires for opposite sex parents. And this is resolved by identifying with the father and learning gendered behavior through him. For girls, they have a sexual desire for their father, and they see their mother as a threat, but they resolve this by identifying with their mother. Most of the stuff is unconscious, so kids aren't consciously feeling these things. Next, in most of school age, is the latency stage. Freud didn't really think that much was happening during this stage. Instead, kids are focusing on social skills and other abilities. And then finally, in the last stage, the genital stage, sexual feelings reawaken, but with appropriate targets. Okay, there are a couple of neo-Freudians who kind of made some modifications to Freud's theory, but still focused on the unconscious. So Carl Jung looked at the personal and collective unconscious, and argues that we see these kind of common themes across time and across culture, and these are unconscious and common parts of our personality. Adler argued that children feel inferior because they compare themselves to adults. And so as adults, they try to overcome these feelings of inferiority, which is what leads to that inferiority complex. And then Karen Horney disagreed with some of Freud's more sexual theories, and she argued that instead of girls having penis envy, which is what Freud said, that instead boys and men have womb envy and are trying to compensate for their ability to bear children by striving to be successful in other ways. Okay, so a number of critiques of psychodynamic theories. First of all, a lot of them drew on anecdotal evidence. So Freud was a psychotherapist. He didn't take notes. He's asking people to remember what happened in their childhood. So he's asking for retrospective accounts. And these potentially could be distorted and affected by these memories. It's also not testable. Things like repressed memories and unconscious, we can never really prove. And there's a good amount of sexism in Freud's theory. But he did put the idea of unconsciousness and personality onto the map. Okay. The humanistic perspective looks at aspects of the personality that make people uniquely humans. So kind of the subjective feelings and freedom of choice, and the reaction against psychoanalysis. So it was really developed as a reaction against psychoanalysis. So Carl Rogers was the big name here, and he argues that everyone has an inner drive leading to self-actualization. We have a self-concept that is kind of how we see ourselves and our qualities, and that self-concept is developed based on how our parents treat us. So kids need parents who give them unconditional positive regard, so they give them love no matter what. And this leads to positive self-concept. In contrast, kids whose parents give them conditional positive regard only show approval when kids do what they want, and this can lead to poor self-esteem, lead kids to question who they are. We also have this potential conflict between who we actually are, our real selves, and our ideal self, which is who we want to be. So that's what this figure is showing. Ideally, our real self and our ideal self somewhat overlap, which makes us feel good. But when we have a big mismatch between who we actually are and who we want to be, this can lead to a lot of anxiety. Again, this theory was kind of hard to test, and it seems like it's maybe a little too optimistic. So this is not a very current theory. Okay. Albert Bandura proposed that we need to look not just at the person, but also at the context. So they argue that there's a number of factors that lead to how our personality is expressed. So we have our behavioral factors, which might be kind of temperament and genes, which influence us. But there's also cognitive factors, so how you interpret the situation, as well as environmental factors. And we have to take all of these into account before we can make a decision. Okay. Next, we're going to get to trait theories. So trait theories are kind of an attempt to efficiently describe personalities with a manageable set of dimensions. So trait is an enduring predisposition to consistently behave in certain ways, and trait theory is a theory of personality that focuses on identifying these differences. One thing we distinguish between is a source trait and a surface trait. So a surface trait is something that's easily inferred from our behavior so that you can see somebody expresses, whereas a source trait is a broad basic dimension that's more universal, and there are fewer source traits that lead to those surface traits that we display. Most trait theories were developed based on factor analysis. So the idea here is you give participants a bunch of questions and figure out which items they answer similarly. So we're going to give people a list of 100 words, ask them to rate themselves on each dimension using a 5-point scale to tell how well it describes you, and see if we can narrow that down to a smaller number to figure out which characteristics kind of hang together. So Raymond Cattell was the first person who did this, and he did a factor analysis with 4,000 items, and he reduced it down to 16 personality dimensions. So you can see them listed here. I won't go over all of them, but they go from reserved to outgoing, less intelligent to more intelligent, timid versus venturesome. And so the idea is that everyone kind of gets a rating on each one of these, and those combined can make up their personality. Next, we have Eysenck, who basically did another factor analysis. He argued that Cattell's theory was a little bit too complicated, and we can pare it down even more. So he looked at 2 dimensions. He looked at neuroticism, which is how emotionally stable someone is. So if somebody is high on neuroticism, they're emotionally unstable. Now, this is within the kind of quote unquote normal realm. So this is not somebody who has a psychological disorder. This is someone who is just throughout the day experiences more emotional fluctuation. They're more neurotic, less emotional fluctuation, will be less neurotic. The other dimension on Eysenk's theory was introversion and extroversion, so how socially oriented someone is. And so based on this, Eysenck came up with 4 different types of personalities. Okay, so the general consensus was that Cattell had too many factors, so those 16 factors were a lot. Eysenck really had too few, and so now probably the most current theory is the Big Five theory of personality. And so there's 5 different categories. Everyone gets a rating on each one. So openness to new experiences has to do with how much individuals like new experiences, right? So if you're a thrill seeker, you like fast cars, skydiving, you'd be high on openness. Whereas if you want to avoid anything that you're not accustomed to, you'd be low on openness. Conscientiousness has to do with how organized or responsible someone is. So somebody high on conscientiousness is very organized and reliable. You'd want to ask them to pick you up at the airport. Somebody low on conscientiousness is unreliable, disorganized. They're the kind of friend who might forget to pick you up. Extroversion has to do with how outgoing someone is. So if you like to study in groups and go to parties and be the center of attention, you're high on extroversion. In contrast, if you prefer small groups or to be alone, you'd be low on extroversion. Agreeableness is how good-natured or friendly someone is. So people who are high on agreeableness are, really easygoing and easy to get along with, whereas people low on agreeableness are going to be kind of irritable and abrasive. And then finally, neuroticism is how much kind of emotional stability someone has. So somebody high on neuroticism experiences greater emotional fluctuation throughout the day. And again, this is still in the normal realm. This is not a psychological disorder. And somebody low in neuroticism experiences less emotional fluctuation. Okay, so there's a significant amount of evidence using this Big Five that personality is biologically based. And so behavioral genetics is the field that studies the relationship between heredity and personality. And this is really through twin and adoption studies, they found support for a genetic influence of personality traits. So in this figure, you can see, so the red line is identical twins who share 100% of their genes. The gray is fraternal twins who share 50%. And you can see on all of the Big Five traits, those identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins, which tells us that there's at least some biological basis to personality. Okay, the final section is on how we measure personality. And so this can be kind of tricky. And the goals of psychological testing to assess personality and other psychological tests are to accurately and consistently reflect characteristics that an individual has and also predict future psychological functioning and behavior. So we'll talk about a couple of different types of tests. But when we're looking at personality tests, it's really important to remember the Barnum effect. And this is basically that there's a sucker born every minute. People tend to give very high accuracy to personality descriptions that are vague and apply to anyone. This is kind of how horoscopes work, right? They give you a very broad general definition. You say, oh, of course that fits me perfectly. We don't want to have personality tests that just give vague descriptions. We want to really be able to distinguish between people. So one of the early types of personality tests were projective tests. Projective tests basically give people ambiguous or unstructured stimuli and ask them to interpret it. These are based on psychodynamic theories. And the idea is that people will transfer their unconscious onto a stimulus, and the examiner has to kind of interpret their answers. To give you an example of what they look like, this is an example of the Rorschach ink blot test. And so you'd give a person an ink blot like this and ask them what they see. Another one is this, which is the thematic apperception test. And basically you give people pictures of people in ambiguous situations and ask them to interpret what's going on. And that's supposed to get at the unconscious. So of course there's a number of problems with projective tests. One is stimulus pull. So often the stimulus, which is supposed to be neutral, contains some kind of clues, like the thematic apperception test. Those people look kind of sad. There's also substantial issues with reliability. So a lot of the interpretation or the scoring is based on how the person giving the test interprets it, and that could create bias. And also validity. Does it accurately measure what it's supposed to? Does your interpretation of a picture actually mean that you are depressed? So another alternative is just directly observing people. So where you might have a professional observe a client engaging in behavior in either a clinical or natural setting. So they might use a rating scale to kind of assign a value to individuals. They might also use a frequency count, so count how frequently a behavior is exhibited. Another common strategy is through interviews, where we have a professional asking questions of the clients. So structured interviews are when the professional asks questions in kind of a standardized measure. So for one example is the SCID, the structured clinical interview for the DSM, which assesses psychological disorders. There are also unstructured interviews where the professional kind of asks a variety of questions, but without a set schedule and without asking the same client the same thing. So this is much more free based on the client's response. Probably the most common way of assessing personality is through self-report inventories. These are kind of structured tests where individuals report on their own answers. And they measure different personality dimensions. So the NEO-PI is based on the Big Five model. The Myers-Briggs is another common one. This is based on Jung's theory of personality types. A lot of jobs use the Myers-Briggs. So if you've ever had to take like a personality test online for a job, sometimes that's what that is. And then the MMPI detects abnormal personality. So this is used to diagnose psychological disorders as well. But all of these inventories compare to kind of standardized or normed scores like we talked about with IQ. And these inventories have good validity and reliability. So these are really the gold standard for personality tests. So that is it.